Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Thanks for your attention. And my name is Vishal. We'll just quickly go through, and since I'm in the way of lunch, I'll just share some key pieces of information which might be useful and reminders for your session here. So I think we have seen this many times during all these 2 days, but I'll just like to go through this again. Climate impact is not about mitigation. All this while we have been talking about mitigation more so. It's also about adaptation and resiliency. Obviously, there are different levels of policy effort that has gone into adaptation and resiliency in different countries. And I'll show you the slide on that as well in terms of as to how different countries have looked at it. But when we look at the mitigation, extreme heat waves are becoming far more important to resolve. And then obviously there is depleting forest reserves, which again biodiversity will play a very big role as we go ahead. Now, rising sea levels will become a reality. Obviously, we need to have food security and some sort of security with respect to the seawalls, especially since most of the economics or the global economics is around the coastal areas. The last part is definitely, which is very, very important, is that we have the science to see where these problems will occur. And we need to have relocation plans early in place. So these relocation plans can also take a little bit of while to basically see how this will work through. So all in all, I think we would have issues regarding mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency. Now, science suggests that we are not in the position to meet the 1.5 degrees target that was suggested as part of the Paris pathways. And if you look at it, I think global emissions are still rising. The growth rate has fallen compared to the decade ago, but then it's still higher than what we expected. So we are definitely not going to meet the 1.5 degrees as what science suggests. But the other problem is the Asia's carbon intensity is 41% higher than the rest of the world, especially in the Southeast Asia and Asia, which includes India, China, and Southeast Asia primarily. And then obviously the fossil fuel infrastructure continues to expand. There are no legible regulations against coal or petroleum or oil or other things. Obviously there is very little regulations as compared to in this part of the world in terms of fossil fuel infrastructure. And then many jurisdictions have yet to implement carbon pricing as well. So I think we are in a state of place where A, we have to do a lot of work on mitigation, B, we have to catch up on adaptation, and C, we have to then see how we basically relocate vulnerable communities. So what are the main focus areas? We are getting into an extreme heat. Now, if you look at your temperature today, it says like the temperature outside is 30 degrees, but feels like 35. That feels like 35 is the measurement of the heat wave. It's not the temperature per se, it's the measurement of the heat wave. So that is basically will destroy people's health, and that will have a big impact as far as we are concerned. Water cycle disruptions will become far more common. You will have extreme climates like flash floods, droughts, or since the water will get diverted to different places and nations will basically divert water from their neighbors, we will see extra problems appearing out of that. We'll also see coastal threats. It's not only rising sea levels, but also the erosion of the sea. So suppose if your building is built on a reclaimed land, you will begin to see some sort of erosion as well. It's not only Singapore, but in other countries as well. So this will be a big area of adaptation as well. The next part is food security. Again, food security, we have looked at crop yield reduction, but we haven't looked at the livestock impact. So it's not only the crops that will get impacted, but also the meat will get impacted. Because of the heat wave, your livestock will not be able to survive. And there will be problems relating to both food as well as meat, crops and meat. So what do we need is a concerted action plan, which doesn't start with just private equity investments or private investments, but it has to have a safety net of financial institutions, private institutions, public institutions, community to community and government to government support. So when we look at this, in DBS, we are looking at the whole picture where we are looking at mitigation from an emission reduction target. Transition to renewables is an important part of the strategy, but renewables again has obtained a new meaning as we go ahead. May not be just wind and solar. Obviously now we are also looking at other means also. Community-based adaptation strategies will become important. Now, what it means is that basically we need to identify our problems, and each location will have to identify their problems with relation to adaptation or resiliency. And from there, ground up, there would be community-based adaptation strategies. This is where the policy infrastructure has to take this into account. This is a most weak area in this part of the world. Adaptation finance. We have hardly seen any sort of adaptation finance coming through, especially when it relates to biodiversity. Half of the people don't understand what are the measures involved in this. How do we relate the success of a biodiverse habitation? We know emission reduction is very easy to do that, but biodiversity is not an issue. This will become a problem. Agricultural technology might be a big issue as we go ahead, and it will be a big part of the adaptation as well. The other part which we are mistakenly not understanding is that we need to increase the social safety net. It's not only this community-based adaptation strategies involves investment and clear action plans. Social safety nets will involve transferring inheritance. There is a lot of land that will pass through inheritance from one agricultural community to another agricultural community. How are we going to train them in adaptation? How are we thinking about that social safety net in this respect? Economic diversification. Are we putting all the eggs in one basket? Is it renewables? Is it nuclear reactors? Is it hydrogen? Is it what? Are we looking at economic diversification to play out the risk as well? So obviously there are different ways to think about resiliency. We are just at the initial stages to think about adaptation, climate investments, and resiliency building. Yes, we have done a lot of work around this, but this is also not sufficient. Now, this is the impact. We will have a series of escalating financial costs due to catastrophic GDP losses. Obviously, you can look at all the reports that are being generated, and probably in the next slide I can show you which cities are at the most risk of adaptation and resiliency. But in fact, if you just invest 1% of your GDP, could actually reduce losses equivalent up to 4% of the GDP. And this is something which has come out of World Economic Forum as well. And Southeast Asia, especially this part of the world, including Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, are highly vulnerable to climate risk and face disproportionately higher climate-related costs. Now, the reason why is, first of all, we have a very large population living in low-lying coastal cities. If you look at the coastline of Vietnam, Indonesia, a lot of people are still staying in low-lying coastal cities, and the economic dependence is still on agriculture and natural resources. So if there is a land adaptation issue, it will affect our food directly for Singapore. Singapore is well placed, but the problem is we still rely on food from our neighbors, and our neighbors will be at risk. When our neighbors are at risk, obviously it will impact as to how we look at relocating them in Singapore or elsewhere outside Singapore. Now, these are the cities which are at very high risk, which includes KL, Jakarta, Ho Chi Minh, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Mumbai, Ahmedabad. These are all the major cities which are basically will be impacted by sea level rise. Obviously, KL not so much, but in fact, you will begin to see as we go ahead into this discussion. And here we are also entering into cyclones. Probably there might be, but there is a good progress of institutional progress that have happened in some cities like Ahmedabad, Dhaka. Some cities like Shanghai have been proactive in creating the sort of infrastructure. But in most of the cities, if you see, their progress is quite low as compared to what is being shown here. So what is our estimate? Our estimate is Southeast Asia requires around 5.2 trillion in climate investments over the next decade to maintain Paris-aligned pathways. And these numbers are derived out of IEA, IMF, and ADB. Obviously, they have given an annual estimate, but our estimate is that it will take at least 10 years of work to get this done. And we estimate the work will be around adaptation primarily and resiliency. Adaptation alone will take 2.5 trillion and maybe 0.5 trillion for resiliency. Mitigation is still covered, but it's not fully covered. So basically, we still have a huge opportunity to do this well. So today, the gap is $4 trillion, given where we are and what is to be done. So there is a huge investment opportunity for private companies, public companies, government to form ecosystems, to work together, to take advantage of this from an economic standpoint and to create prosperity without taking risk of our climate change. Now, these are the most viable pathways that we see for mitigation. From a technology point of view, small modular reactors might become very commercially viable. Obviously, we can expect like 300 megawatt nuclear reactors to play a big role in how we look at our cities today. And especially if we consider the cities in Ho Chi Minh or cities in Indonesia or Singapore for that matter, or any Southeast Asian countries, nuclear reactors, especially with 300 megawatts, can play a big role without creating enough risk for the country. Now, the only problem is the public acceptance of this, as well as how do you manage nuclear waste. So the management of nuclear waste will be a very big industry in this part of the world. There are a lot of companies who are getting into creating modular reactors. Obviously, there are many technologies that are coming. There are almost 80 blueprints which are open sourced, where you can go and create a nuclear reactor as long as you have access to plutonium or uranium. But there is no blueprint for managing nuclear waste. So this is an upcoming industry, huge opportunity and we can see that the first commercial units will be out by 2030. There's a huge potential for this area. Now, if we look at carbon capture and storage, obviously there are two technologies in this one. One is called a carbon capture unit, which is an old school methodology, where basically you just capture the carbon and then use it from the atmosphere. Whereas CCS is basically capturing carbon at the source of creation. And here you can basically produce blue hydrogen. But obviously, this involves a little bit of infrastructure, and there is a little bit of understanding around this. And then obviously, you have something called low carbon hydrogen, where you can actually do electrolysis at scale, water electrolysis at scale. But now this is still not a fully developed technology. Obviously, this is still at $2 a kg, but obviously it can be scaled up depending on how you use CCS. And this might be an interesting area to look at as well. So now, what are the areas where we see specifically for Southeast Asia? Climate resilient infrastructure has a big part. We may have to look at how we design our new roads, especially given the heat wave propagation in this part of the world. And it's a big area to think about. We may have to redesign and reconstruct some of the roads in terms of as to how we look at heat propagation. And this will be a big area as we go ahead. The other areas would be on ports, in terms of as to how you build coastal walls for the ports, and what sort of water levels you would need for your ships to land. And so basically we may have to plan for the rise in the sea level, but then you will have to spend a huge money for making the ports resilient in this respect. So most of our ports are not designed for sea level rise. So that's an interesting area to look at. Agriculture technology is going to be a big area, which is quite underestimated. I haven't seen any presentations on agri-tech. Agri-tech will be a big area for investments, especially in this part of the world. It's a rice bowl for half of the population, which is comparable to a population of India. So this is where we see a big area. Then we have nature-based solutions. Obviously, this is for biodiversity. So here we can redesign from a swamp-based biodiversity to something like a tropical diverse place, where we can actually change the climate as well of this place. So there are huge opportunities in terms of as to how you look at Southeast Asia. But obviously there is a lot of work that is required when it comes to this part. And this is where I go back to this slide. It has to be an ecosystem. So you can't get this done without having a proper ecosystem of community-based adaptation strategies where government is fully bought into this, and social safety nets, which is the weakest area today in terms of as to how you look at the land and the inheritance of that part. So this is the end of the presentation. Our conclusion is still that science suggests that current mitigation measures are not enough to meet the 1.5 degrees target. Obviously, Asia needs a holistic strategy where you merge mitigation, adaptation, resiliency, and measures to correct the cause. So you can't look at mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency by industry sector. You have to look at it from the location point of view. And that's a different dimension. So you can look at climate change from a sectoral perspective, or you can look at from a location perspective. But where you put in the investments, those investments will be very different from that point of view. The nature of the investment will differ from that point of view. And here, our estimate is 5 trillion. Actually, this is, I would say it's conservative at this point in time. GIC alone has made an estimate of around 11 trillion over until 2050 only for mitigation. This is for adaptation, resiliency, and mitigation put together for 10 years. This is around, so I think it's doable. And then this will be a central challenge for policymakers, financiers, and international partners to come together. Happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.